Afternoon. Welcome to the U.S. release of the Berggruen Institute's Future of Democracy new report. We're excited to present this distinguished panel to you today to discuss what's a remarkably ambitious report. Why do I say that it's ambitious? After all, a new book comes out every day talking about the challenges to democracy. What's ambitious about this report is that it actually provides a roadmap of answers. It provides specific recommendations for what we can do to restore democratic governance. We have a distinguished panel to provide us this roadmap today, starting with former Prime Minister of Denmark, Helle Thorning-Schmidt. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Nathan Gardels, who's the editor-in-chief of Noema magazine, a co-founder and senior advisor at the Berggruen Institute. Mary Scudder, who's an assistant professor at Purdue University, and Dawn Nakagawa, who's going to start us out. Dawn is the co-director of this Future of Democracy project. She's the executive vice president at the Berggruen Institute, and we're looking to Dawn to tell us, what is this project? How did you have the courage to launch it? What were you trying to do? And then after we hear about that, we're going to turn to former Prime Minister Helle Thorning-Schmidt, who's going to tell us what the report actually says. And then we'll have a discussion with Mary and Nathan to dig into some of the details. We'll open it up for your questions. The way you can submit those is at the bottom of your screen. There's a button that you can push. If you submit your questions, I'll be able to read them, and then I will ask them of the panel. So thank you very much for joining us. Dawn, why don't you take it away and explain what on earth you guys thought you were doing when you started this project?
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much. And thank you to German Marshall Fund for hosting this today. We're really, really grateful for this opportunity to talk about our work. And thanks for pointing out that we were a little nuts to take it on in the first place. I think it goes back to the origins of the Berggruen Institute. The Institute is 10 years old, and the first projects we took on were basically looking at how to improve the competence of democracy. This was back in 2010, sort of soon after the financial crisis. And we were seeing sort of a looming crisis of legitimacy as a result of some of the missteps and the challenges that our democratic institutions were facing. And that wasn't just here in the United States, where it seems to be most acute at the moment, but across Western democracies, particularly in the face of some of the great strides that were being made in Asian countries that were less democratic. So we were looking at capacity building. We were looking at structure and processes and how to increase the competence of the system overall. In around 2015, we started to see this new set of emergent challenges as a result of the information ecosystem, and we looked quite hard for a few years at what those challenges are to sort of democratic norms and practices and institutions. And now they're all quite well known, whether it's misinformation or hyper-targeting or misuse of private data or whatever. And we looked at that as a new horizon of challenges added on to the ones that our democratic institutions were already facing. And so it was as a result of looking at all this and together, I think, that we came to the conclusion that what we really needed was a new kind of democracy for the 21st century. Our institutions are at best 20th century. They were built to govern an analog, industrial, international society, and we are very much a global and digital society today, with an economy that is rapidly sloughing off human labor as part of its productivity calculation. So we actually need an entirely different set of institutions. So yes, it was a bold challenge that we took on, and one that we did with the help of fantastic people, including yourself, Helle Thorning-Schmidt, Tony Giddens, and a number of other people who were really helpful at helping us think through the set of challenges that democracy faces in the 21st century. But at the heart of it, what the conclusion we came to was that it really is society that has evolved quite a bit. Our expectation for voice and choice and agency has deepened and broadened. And our institutions haven't actually evolved to accept or absorb that in a formalized way. So people are marching, they're petitioning, they're voting with their dollars, they're doing all of these things that are not formal mechanisms in our democracy. And so our challenge was to recognize that that was happening and to figure out a way to kind of harness it and create institutions that could absorb and deepen our participation. So democracy doesn't have to be, one person, one vote. There are lots of different ways to do it. So how do we sort of harness the opportunities, particularly available to us because of technology, and also manage the downside risk of some of those same technologies? And so that was kind of the challenge we took on. And we looked at it in 3 parts. One was the social cohesion, which really needs to be addressed in a fragmented, increasingly polarized society. Doing what we could about the digital public square and the corruption of it. And then finally, democratic institutions. So I'm going to hand it over to my amazing panelists to talk about the specifics of what those recommendations were. We're not alone in thinking that democracy in the 21st century is challenged. There's a lot of other people out there with great ideas. These were just some of the ideas that we thought should be put forward and into the dialogue. It's not so much a blueprint, but much more a set of ideas that we think are worth considering and an opportunity to start a really important conversation of how do we create a resilient 21st century democracy. So that's it. Thank you so much again, Karen, for giving us this opportunity. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much. That was really useful scene setting and why we're talking about this in a program on the digital future, because that is so much of the context we're talking about it. Helle, can you take us into the report and what it is that you're recommending and why? Oh, I think you're on mute. And if I didn't say that, sorry, go ahead.
Zoom mistake. Well, thank you, Karen, and to the whole team and the panel for being part of this and organizing this. It's great to discuss these issues in this time. So basically, it all started with us seeing that democracy is in crisis, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and trying to work out how we can renew democracy and legitimize democracy again. And just to be clear, the crisis is actually real. We can measure that fewer people feel that it is essential to live in a democracy. It's declining quite dramatically. I was surprised to see that. We can also see traditional participation decline, membership of political parties, all those things that used to constitute participation in the old days. And all this is underpinned by a lack of trust in democracy, a lack of trust that democracies can actually solve the real issues of our times. For some people, that will be climate change. For other people, it will be institutional racism. For other people, it will be important migration and migration issues. It will be pandemics, perhaps. And for other people, it would be enormous inequalities that is created by the market economy. So the issue is that democracies cannot solve the big issues. And on top of that, we have other issues, as Dawn is suggesting. So basically, we looked at 3 factors. We looked at the lack of social cohesion. We looked at the new public square that has to be created in the new digital age. And we looked at this complex question of how institutions have not caught up with the times and the expectations that exist in society. What do we mean by that? Well, we mean that a lot of the lack of credibility comes from the fact that society in some ways have evolved away from the slow representative ways that we used to have democracy, where the main participation is that you vote every 4, 5, 6 years. You go and give your vote, and that's your main and most important contribution to democracy as a citizen. And yes, there is a certain apathy that exists, but on top of that, or next to that apathy, there's also a strong participatory impulse that needs to come out. People are creating movements, they're protesting, they are perhaps even voting for populist leaders that say they can change things from one day to the other. And basically, society expects decisions to be fast and governments to be hyper responsive to their demands. Action things get customized solution, and everything has to happen here and now in real time. And our main thinking was, in order to save democracy, it has to be adapted to all these modern expectations. And our question was basically whether you can make institutional reforms that will absorb all these criticism of democracy, the new digital age, and also these participatory impulses. So a few words about our actual suggestions. First of all, we started with social cohesion. We had no doubt that democracies would be respected or accepted or loved better if they were able to create social cohesion, fairness, opportunity, and actually solving the most pressing issues of our time. And the headline for that was that democracy still is what it does. If democracy does good things, it will be respected more by citizens. But it was also very clear to us that this lack of social cohesion that we are seeing across the board is not the only explanation of why democracy is in crisis. I'll come back to talking about this pent-up demand for participation. But what we also see is that we need to define a new public square in the digital age. And that comes from the fact that the digital age has forever changed the way we debate with each other, the way we get information, whether we can trust the information that we get. And this is such a complex issue. We were debating this a lot, and we came up with three things where we feel that there could be a small contribution to creating this new public square in a digital age. And I'll go through them quite quickly. One was a windfall tax on media giants to fund local journalism, which has been completely changed in the digital age. Actually, in many places, it doesn't exist anymore. So a new windfall tax to support that. The other was to establish principles for new public interest media, to define actually what are the principles for the new media. It's not about creating a new BBC. It is more about supporting media outlets that lives up to a certain standard for independent and trustworthy journalism. And thirdly, we also discussed a lot a more clearly defined and enhanced duty of care for social media platforms, which could involve more regulation, more transparency on how and why content is removed or stays up on social media platform, how content is ranked and prioritized, how the algorithms work to do that, and perhaps a new system to prevent hyper targeting. We had loads of discussions around that, but these were some of the suggestions we came up with. But it also became very clear to us that that wasn't enough either, and that we also need to come up with our ideas to how to renovate our democratic institutions. They're simply not working anymore, and the way we participate is not working for the reasons I mentioned earlier. So we had to come up with some really concrete ideas of how to change that. And some of them was around citizens' assemblies and working in a completely new way around democracy, as Dawn mentioned. The other one was to look at our youth and find out how can we train our youth into democracy, for example, by doing a new youth service in democracy. And so these were some of the suggestions, which was basically had the headline of creating participation without populism. We feel that there is an element, there is a readiness to do that, and what is next is to come up with real solid and tangible ideas. I know my colleagues will go deeper into all these suggestions, so it's basically looking at the crisis of democracy, coming up with ideas in 3 different areas, and using that as a starting point for the conversation, which needs to start, because there's no doubt, and there's no doubt when you go through it deeper, as we do in the report, that our democracy is in crisis, and we need to rethink democracy. Thank you very much.
There's such ambitious and exciting ideas. We're going to turn to Nathan and Mary. Nathan, I think Helle just talked about participation without populism. Do you want to expand on that and tell us what some of the ideas are for institutional reforms that are needed? I know you have firsthand experience with some of them, and then others you've observed.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. You know, as everyone who has spoken so far has alluded already, democracies across the West are at various stages of implosion. In America today, we're on the cusp of a political and cultural civil war, where on the one hand, you've got populist demagoguery, on the other hand, you have cancel culture. And in that kind of polarized environment, elections will only solidify and deepen divisions, not diminish them. So in the report, and this has been developing some time across the West, as we know. So in the report, we talk about one such path out of polarization is to invite the broad civil society between the partisan extremes into governance through new institutional arrangements that enable and encourage compromise and negotiation to reach consensus. So to borrow a term from the COVID battle, this can be done through what we call anti-inflammatory therapeutic of deliberative democracy. And this is what Helle referred to and what you have referred to, Karen, as participation without populism. Deliberative democracy is where a sampling of citizens, indicative of the public as a whole, gathers in neutral, nonpartisan settings to hear experts present the facts, deliberate policy choices that then will inform the decisions of governments, parliaments, and publics when it comes to referendums, or in the case of a place like California, citizen ballot initiatives. Now, the best example of this recently is the Citizens Convention on Climate in France, which just completed its work 2 weeks ago. Everyone will remember the uprising, really, of the Yellow Jackets in France over the issue of a fuel tax to help curb global warming. One of the demands of that Yellow Jacket movement was that citizens need to have a voice directly in policies that affect them in their daily lives. So in acceding to that demand, President Macron put together or acceded to the demand to have a Citizens Convention on Climate. This group of 150 people, drawn from a pool of 250,000 that represented the entire body politic in terms of region, education, race, gender, etc. This group met over 7 weekends, going through April and May, hearing experts and looking at the impact on climate of everything from transportation to fashion. 2 weeks ago, they made their recommendations without filter, meaning they weren't filtered through the president's office. They weren't filtered through the parliament. These were the citizens that were brought together to represent the entire public, making their recommendations. President Macron accepted those recommendations 2 weeks ago, agreed to put $17 billion behind implementation and to take any of the measures that required constitutional changes to a public referendum. At the end of that process, Macron said that, at the end of the presentation, Macron told the convention, "You have shown that it is possible on even the most difficult and flammable subject to create consensus." Some may know a similar process took place in Ireland 2 years ago on another issue, probably the most controversial issue in a Catholic country like Ireland, on whether or not an anti-abortion clause should be taken out of the Constitution. The Citizens Assembly met over many months, experts, different sides making their case, like in a trial, like in a jury, pro, con, so on. They came to a consensus that this clause should be taken out of the Constitution. it was put to a public referendum and then was passed overwhelmingly by the public. So these kind of citizen assemblies, deliberative democracy, policy juries, citizen review panels, we argue in the report, are the coming feature of democracy in the 21st century. I'm both as democracy sink further into partisan rancor and even civil strife, and the more there's a demand, as Helle talked about, for an inclusive politics, these kind of deliberative practices will become as integral to the practice of liberal democracy as elections have been for representative government. Now, in the report, finally, we catalog, essentially, these various activities taking place all across the world, from Chile to Iceland. They're in the works, they're gaining momentum, and as democracies continue to polarize, I think people will look more to this kind of participation without populism as a way to reach a governing consensus and get out of this kind of protracted crisis that we've been in. Thank you. I think you're muted, Karen.
I did it too. It's so useful to have these examples. I know when you were first talking about these, I was skeptical as someone who's been in a lot of meetings that these would represent, you know, what a friend of mine calls the illusion of inclusion, and that they would feel like empty exercises. And giving these examples, I think, has helped at least show me how valuable they can be, and I hope others as well. And I want to give full credit that the participation without populism was Helle's phrase, and I intend to use it all the time. I love that. Mary, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what you've talked about as dispositional attributes, or the ethic of citizenship. And what is it, what's the responsibility or the skill set that we need to bring to participate in these kinds of endeavors?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Karen, and thanks for including me in this panel. So if we're going to set our hopes for renewing democracy on deliberation, and I'm a deliberative Democrat, that's my line of research, so I wholly support what Nathan just described there. We have to consider the sort of skill set that citizens will need to bring to those encounters. And by deliberation, I mean not only the formal initiatives that Nathan described, but also the everyday conversations that we have with our family members and neighbors and friends, because these conversations help shape our political positions and priorities and sort of shape the opinions that we express in a vote. And so they're really relevant for the health of our democracy. In the Renewing Democracy report, I speak to the question of renewing social cohesion and specifically detailing how we might cultivate an ethic of citizenship that's needed by a robust sort of public sphere where citizens are deliberating with one another. And I discussed 3 specific suggestions, which I will touch on briefly, and these are not exhaustive. They're just the same thing as Don mentioned, sort of ways to get conversation starters, things we need to be thinking about if this is a priority. So first, I discussed the need to design civic education programs so that they focus as much on the nature and value of democracy as they do on the nuts and bolts of how governments work. So think about U.S. civics curriculum and the kinds of civics courses that are required of U.S. high school students and for many college degrees. The curriculum often focuses on the number of representatives in Congress or senators' term limits, how a bill becomes a law. Now think about the last conversation you may have had about the 2020 election in the United States. What were you talking about? Were you talking about the latest campaign strategy or the latest poll, dynamics of the Electoral College? This view of democracy is much too thin to sustain the kind of robust citizenship that we're talking about here. And so our civic education efforts should focus less on logistics and more on the meaning and value of democracy itself. Why do we value democracy? What is the difference between democracy and populism? We should consider, right, that our own freedom and autonomy are dependent on democracy itself, on having a say in the laws, on the laws to which we are held, right? We should be able to, these laws are going to confront us with coercive force of the state, and so citizens need to be included, and we need to consider other people's perspectives when we go to the ballot box, right? That voting in politics is essentially an exercise of power over other people. So I developed this further in the report. And the other thing I want to talk about is that while we need a thicker understanding of what democracy means, we also need to be more realistic about what is expected and required of citizens engaging in deliberation. So, excuse me, my second point that I bring up in the report, the suggestion, is the need to cultivate a greater acceptance of disagreement and conflict in politics. So if we're expecting people to deliberate with one another, they need to understand that this won't always lead to agreement. As Nathan described, people can actually reach a lot more agreement than we think that they can, given current partisanship and polarization, but we don't actually need to empathize with our fellow citizens all the time, or actually see them as friends. Now, this might seem counterintuitive when it comes to renewing social cohesion, but I argue that cooperation in contexts of difference and disagreement is actually strengthened when we recognize the legitimacy of disagreement and some level of conflict in a democracy. So think about, for example, if I have to sit down with someone who I deeply disagree with, or a political opponent, if I have to sit down with them, and if the goal is to reach some sort of agreement or compromise, I may not even sit down with them in the first place over deeply decided, deeply contested issues. So sort of accepting that conflict is going to persist and that we don't have to resolve anything could actually help spur people into the sort of difficult conversations that democracy requires. So the problem with empathy-based approaches to democracy in deeply plural and divided societies is that democratic deliberation becomes an almost impossible task. Not only do I have to listen and engage with someone, now I have to sort of empathize, put myself in their shoes. And this might be somebody who I find deeply offensive or saying things with which I deeply disagree. And so I argue in my own work and then in the report also that these expectations are not only too high, they're actually democratically unnecessary. So a good democratic life can include some level of controversy and conflict. And I think that if we were to sort of help people accept that and see that, and this would be in contrast to current civic education efforts that often focus on building civic friendship and empathy, we actually could get further. And the third strategy for democratic revitalization through an ethic of citizenship that I discuss in the report is the importance of institutionalizing expectations to listen. And this can happen in the classroom by including sort of metrics of listening when we evaluate students' participation in class, which is often something that we don't articulate a value for, but also in Congress, right? So giving Congress, representatives in Congress listening training when they're oriented to their new position. In recent weeks, we've seen the explosion of listening sessions on the issue of racism and discrimination and policing across the United States. And I think it's easy maybe to dismiss these sessions as purely symbolic, but given the importance of listening for democracy, I think that we should recognize the potential that these have and really the sort of opportunity that they present. But for these to really work, we have to be clear about what we expect and how we will evaluate their success. So recently there was a white councilwoman in Baton Rouge who was shopping on the internet during a meeting on the renaming of a school that's named after Robert E. Lee. And she was called out for this, right? That's a very obvious sign of someone not listening. And so I think we need to we can't just say that holding a listening session is sort of the answer. We have to think about how to make these actually work. So finally, the evidence in deliberative democratic theory is really clear that when citizens are given the opportunity to participate in more meaningful ways than voting, right, that they actually rise to the occasion, and that the citizens who are turned off from partisan politics and who maybe don't go to the polls as much as we want them to are precisely those who welcome the opportunity to do something in a more sort of robust and more difficult, but also more fulfilling way. And so this sort of virtuous cycle can be created where citizens sort of do this hard work of democracy because they expect to be heard. And then the representatives actually listen because they trust that these citizens have done this hard work and are expressing an informed opinion and aren't sort of pulling them in these sort of deeply partisan ways. So I think there's a lot of hope for us to expect citizens to do this work that we're talking about. Thank you.
So now we have a bunch of the ideas on the table. There was one more that I wanted to ask about, which is the youth core that was in the report. Did anyone want to talk about that? Nathan, did you want to lay that out?
That's not really my bailiwick, although I am
Okay.
on the favor of it, of putting people from different walks of life out of their social silos into common experiences. But I think Dawn is really the person on that.
I'm happy to do it. So the youth environmental service idea came out of the social cohesion work that we were doing. Just as Molly said, we were looking for ways in which we could embed a new skill set into into our public in order to be the kind of citizen required for this kind of democracy, right? A citizen's democracy. It requires a very new skill set. It requires talking across lines. And so how are we going to do that? In addition to new education systems around civics, we were thinking about programs that could bring people together. One of the things that was happening while we had this commission set up was there was an enormous amount of youth energy around the environment and a lot of pressure on policymakers to sort of either step up and do the right thing or to hand over the reins of climate to a younger generation of people who really do need to take this seriously. And so one of the members of our commission, Martin Moore, just piped up one day with the idea of a new kind of civic service called Youth Environmental Service. It is actually an idea that we've been sharing with a lot of different policymakers from different countries, and it's getting a lot of traction right now, not just as an idea to engage in a new kind of national service for the sake of solidarity, but also as part of a recovery project from the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of governments are worried about youth not having a lot to do, not having a lot of opportunities. The climate crisis is not going away. It still looms, and there's a lot of energy among young people around it. So it's an idea that's getting traction. We've been having conversations with both state governments in the United States and national organizations, as well as governments across Europe about it. So we're hopeful that this idea might get off the ground.
That's terrific. And so Helle, I wanted to bring it back to you. And as Dawn has laid out some of the next step efforts that are going on, I know that you have taken on this extremely high profile role of co-chairing this new Facebook effort on content moderation. And I'm wondering if you see that as consistent with some of the findings from this report, especially the duty of care recommendation, or do you see it somehow in conflict?
I mean, first of all, on the duty of care, I think there's no doubt that social media platforms have developed quite a lot over the last few years. I think since the scandal of 2016 and other issues, the duty of care and what that actually means for a platform like Facebook has become much clearer to them. And the way I see it is that the new oversight board, which is basically the idea with the oversight board, is that we have the final say on content on Facebook and Instagram, which basically means that this responsibility of deciding what gets removed or what stays up on Facebook and Instagram is no longer only the decision of Facebook and ultimately Mark Zuckerberg. Now this decision has been socialized into an oversight board, which is for now is 20 members. It will be 40 over the next year. I'm one of the co-chairs, and we will now take these decisions. So when a user is not happy with the decision that Facebook has taken, they can appeal to this oversight board, and we will take the decision. What I'm hoping from this is that it's totally in line with what we have suggested in this report. It's basically that we'll get more transparency on content decision. We will get more insight into the ranking system and how artificial intelligence and how this works. And in time, we will be all of us will be much better educated in what content stays up and what gets removed, how the community standards is interpreted, how they can be changed, because also our decisions will also be part of changing the community standards. So that is one part of it. There's obviously many parts of Facebook and Instagram which we will not be regulating, and that's up to the regulators, to politicians to take over and regulate for that. For example, the windfall tax that we're suggesting, that's completely outside our remit. So I do think, yes, it is part of democratizing this, because we are socializing the decisions on content on Facebook and Instagram.
And that's very helpful. And Nathan, you talked about these participatory endeavors, and we've got a question that brings this up from Bogota, Colombia, actually. But how can the digital environment, as Helle was starting to talk about, a new revitalized digital environment, how can that help with the kind of deliberative activities that you're talking about, or can it? Can this work online? Do you have examples of that? And then there's a wrinkle to that question, which we've gotten from a couple of people, including Rebecca McKinnon, who's a scholar in this area, which is, can this really happen on social media? Do we want these kinds of deliberative activities happening on these private platforms like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube? So maybe you can speak to what's happened in the past and what you'd like to see in the future.
Yeah, if I may, I want to underscore a couple of points that were just made before you asked that question. Your own comment, Karen, at introducing me about your doubts about deliberative democracy as an empty process. I think it's important to understand that the difference between these kind of citizen assemblies or deliberative polling. The point of citizen assemblies or policy juries and so on is they have to be directly linked to impact on decisions. They can't be just a polling that they hope people listen to. To be effective, and as in the case of both Ireland and the case of France, which I talked about, they're directly linked to an impact in governance. The other point I wanted to make, just underscore, is what Mary talked about, disagreement. No one should be naive and say you can somehow depoliticize politics. There will be disagreement. People have different interests. People have different worldviews. What's essential is that the process is trusted as neutral in the sense that everyone has a voice, everyone has a ready agency. In the report, Bruno Kaufmann from Switzerland talks about the Swiss initiative system and how there are happy losers. And what he means by that is that you go to the polls in a referendum and you may lose. You battle it out in the political space, but you know that there's a ready agency if you're dissatisfied with the outcome to do it again. So the point is that the institutions have to be neutral in order to guarantee disagreement, which is a fundamental aspect of democracy. On the digital point, in fact, because the French Citizen Convention on Climate took place much of the time during the COVID crackdown, many of the sessions were conducted on Zoom. Way before the COVID crisis in Taiwan, they've been doing digital deliberation for several years now under the digital minister, Audrey Tang. This whole digital deliberation aspect of Taiwan democracy grew out of the protest movements in 2014. And they have gone to the extent of every year holding an annual presidential hackathon in which 10 million people, that's half the population of Taiwan, participate in ranking the priorities of what the government should pursue, proposing solutions and policies that the government should adopt, and trying to set the agenda. In addition to that, they have regular deliberative sessions. For example, on a couple of years ago on Uber. To what extent should Uber be allowed into the taxi market? What should the taxis do, and so on? Now in California, we're battling that out. We're battling out. The legislature decided that everyone who works for Uber should be considered an employee, mainly the unions, and the companies oppose it. So the legislature, which is sympathetic to the unions, passed a law that said everyone who's an Uber driver should be an employer. Now the Uber and Lyft went to the public ballot in November to try to overturn the legislation in a referendum. So we're battling it out instead of having a process like they did online through vTaiwan, Virtual Taiwan, in which they were able to forge consensus. So in many ways, because of the spatial issues involved in larger countries, especially like France, the digital capacity actually can improve the capacity of deliberative democracy.
And what do you think about this issue, or maybe it's for the next report, Jody? I'm giving you more work. What do you think about this issue of having your deliberative democracy on these private platforms, on a Facebook or a Twitter or a YouTube, when we don't really understand how the algorithms work and we don't have full transparency? Or is that a question for the next day?
Well, I'm not sure. This is the first time I've actually heard the question. I mean, I'm not sure that it matters. I mean, we're having a discussion here on this space.
Yep.
A public discussion with people from all over the world. I'm not sure. I mean, it'd be different if we were in China. You know, everyone probably knows what happened when there was a Zoom discussion about celebrating the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, and the Chinese made Zoom cut off the conversation. But as long as Helle is there watching what Facebook does for us, or Zoom in the West, I mean, obviously there need to be some ground rules. But I don't really see a conflict. You know, we have debates on television which are privately licensed or publicly licensed private companies.
But if I can just add to that, yeah. There's no doubt that the new digital age really adds some challenges to our democracies. And I think that our discussion was actually quite balanced, because we love what the digital age can do for us, that we get connected, that we can create, like the whole Black Lives Matter movement, like the Me Too movement, all these movements that has brought people from different parts of the world together in a movement where we all can fight for the same thing. That's fantastic, and many other fantastic things. And I know so many vulnerable communities in very poor countries that have created their own groups where they're helping each other. So that's so many good things, but there are also so many bad things, and I don't have to list them all. And the new democratic battle is to find out, how do we enhance democracy in this new digital age, and try to regulate where we can, not only hard regulation, but also make these companies take their own part of responsibility. And no one has all the answers, but what we're trying in the report is to discuss and get closer to some of these answers.
I love that idea of the hard regulation and then the self-regulation or the softer regulation as a way to think about those. Molly, maybe you can talk, Helle just raised Black Lives Matter and Me Too, and there's a lot more awareness now about diversity and inclusion. How do these conversations, both the deliberative democracy that Nathan's been talking about and the ethic of citizenship that you've been talking about, how do they work in a really diverse world where you want to make sure that people who have a little less power, you know, outside of the deliberation can participate fully? You know, what are some of your thoughts about all that?
Yeah, great, thank you. That's a really important question. I think one thing, among other things, Black Lives Matter movement, the protests have shown us that, you know, these are gaining popularity nationwide and internationally. And I think that, among other things, they highlight failures of listening that have been endemic to U.S. politics for you know, since the beginning, before our founding. And so while a majority of US citizens now say that they support the Black Lives Matter movement, as recently as 2017, it was the opposite. A majority of US citizens said they disagreed with that.
I think Zoom is freezing us.
Yeah. Molly's freezing.
Uh-oh. Do either of you do you want to speak to that while we're unfreezing her? Maybe just how does this all play in with the Black Lives Matter movement and the need for diverse membership in these deliberative processes?
Well, I mean, I think it's, as I said in my comments about cancel culture, on the one hand and populist demagoguery on the other hand. These are issues that can only be resolved through the kind of deliberative processes that we're talking about. If you battle them out in the electoral space alone, in which partisans vie for power by any means necessary, witness Donald Trump's, what they call his dog whistles. Some even think, you know, he feels this to his advantage to provoke a race war. The electoral arena will only divide the body politic further. So I really think that when you come to these kind of deep issues, you've got to move to this deliberative model, or you're never going to get out of polarization.
And you, Helle, you are a close observer of Europe, of the UK, of US politics. You ran a country. Are there some issues that are more suited to these kinds of activities that we can better handle through deliberative democracy, and others that we leave to the legislator or to voting? Or do you think that this is a way forward for all kinds of issues?
Well, I have to be actually honest about this. I came into this thinking that, isn't it just easier if we have representative democracy? Isn't it just easier? Isn't that just and do people really want to get engaged in these kind of deliberative fora? Do they have the time for that? I mean, we all got our lives to live. We got our children, our jobs, our houses, our everything. Do people want to get engaged? But I do think, as Nathan has said, that over the time we've been working with this, it has also been very clear that you can actually create new ways of having a deliberative process in a democracy where citizens get involved in a completely new way. Nathan was talking about the climate discussion in France. In other countries, we have seen these kind of deliberations as well. And of course, Switzerland, which is a country that votes about very small things and very big things, they discuss these things. They discuss a variety of things all the time. So I have come to the conclusion that maybe there is no real limit for this. Even very supranational issues like climate change. I mean, no government can solve this on their own. They can have, they can go through this process, but also very small issues, whether you can smoke in certain places in Switzerland, can go through a vote. And then we have, of course, the big debates around abortion rights, which we've had in Ireland and Poland over the recent years, which also have been decided by these kind of big discussions and ultimately referenda. So I've come to the conclusion that there are no limits to what we can debate, and I didn't always feel like that, because I'm a strong proponent of representative democracy, but I do think these citizens' initiative can really enhance and maybe help democracy survive the new age. And I also have Molly back.
Karen, can I just add to that real quick?
Sure.
Yeah. So I think it's important in the report we talk about deliberative democracy being a complement and in some way a compensation for the declining legitimacy of representative government, not a substitution for it. As I mentioned briefly before, in the case of California, we have the Citizens Ballot Initiative, in which any group of citizens, well, although usually organized special interests, that's another discussion, can put something on the ballot for the public to vote directly. We changed that law to enable the legislature to negotiate with sponsors, because unintended consequences, unconstitutionality, all kinds of things pop up in citizen ballot initiatives. So the legislature can negotiate with sponsors, and if they come to agreement, they could pass the measure by legislation, and the citizens can withdraw it. In this way, we got both the minimum wage law, the landmark minimum wage law in California, and the first Digital Privacy Act in the United States, was initiated by citizens, but negotiated into let's call it a more sound policy by negotiation with the legislature. So these are not one or other; they're complementary. Deliberative democracy and representative government.
And it's so interesting, the examples that you use, because, I wanted to keep in mind what Helle had said at the beginning, that democracy still is what it does. And you're talking about solving real world problems. I want to return to that concept in a second, but Mary, we lost you there.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know what happened, but I'm on my phone now. I hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think these protests that we've been seeing in the United States and internationally in sort of demanding that we recognize Black Lives Matter really highlight failures of listening that we've seen for decades and centuries. And we don't yet know how to explain the increased support for the Black Lives Matter movement. Over the last 2 months, we've seen it really explode in popularity. But I do think it's important that we ask what it says about US politics and people's willingness to listen to their fellow citizens, that Black folks had to take to the streets to protest during a deadly pandemic, no less, in order for their voices to finally be heard by some segments of society. I do, again, do have reason for optimism. Like I said, these protests have seemed to be effective and gotten people's attention. Another issue that your question raises relates to the uneven burdens that this sort of view of citizenship can pose for some citizens. So inclusive deliberation will include not only the voices and perspectives of historically oppressed and excluded, but also the voices of democracy's enemies, like racists and misogynists. And so expecting people who are targeted by hate speech to listen generously and seriously to those who seek to oppress them is unfair, right? I think that that's true. But at the same time, you can't solve these unfair burdens by simply suggesting that some can listen less and some can listen more. Those who are most vulnerable to oppression often have no choice but to listen and listen carefully for those who would do them harm and who threaten them. So ultimately, I think it's incumbent for small D Democrats, people who are really committed to renewing democracy, to recognize these uneven burdens that go along with deliberation and a universal expectation to listen, and continuously think through how we can alleviate them, while also remembering that, the listening will not go on forever. At the end of the day, we are making decisions, and, we can say to people, we've listened to you, we've heard you. Here I'm thinking about the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. We can say, like, we've heard your perspective and we reject it on the grounds that this is racist, and sort of empower people to sort of make those responses forcefully.
And I wanted to turn back to Helle, because I thought this was so powerful when you said democracy still is what it does, and that we have these underlying challenges that we're all confronting in the era of globalization and inequality. And I wasn't sure if there were parts of this discussion that we were missing that would address some of those underlying concerns.
Yeah, I think that what we're all seeing is that democracy is stronger where personal agency is stronger. And that meant that we had to ask the question, what actually creates that agency? And what is very clear to us is that freedom, empowerment, a job, a livelihood, agency to change one's own life, freedom to choose who you love, respect in general society. I could go on because the list is very long. What creates agency? So we felt there's no doubt that the starting point for democracy is that we have some kind of social cohesion, where we have equity and where all of us have some kind of agency, not only in our own lives, but also in the life society we're participating in. So we couldn't talk about democracy without understanding that social cohesion is made of many different components, and without it, you can never have true democracy. I hate, because I'm Danish, to always talk about Denmark, but I do think that the Nordic countries, which have created more equal societies, where people can actually live the Norwegian dream or the Danish dream or the Swedish dream and fulfill their own dreams, that is a better foundation for keeping democracy. But as I said before, it also became clear to us that that's not enough either. And these other factors came on top of that. And that's why we started also challenging ourselves, coming up with concrete and tangible ideas to how we could beyond social cohesion, how we could improve democracy. It was important for us to understand that it was a layered approach to democracy, and one thing will never be good enough. You have to look at these three components, and perhaps even more that we didn't put in the report.
There's a question that was posed about climate change, and I want to use that as just a jumping off point so that you can all say whatever last remarks you want to make and point people towards what they can do in their pursuit of renewing democracy, how they can be involved with what Berggruen is doing or what your individual projects are. And this question about climate change and what we can do I think it's really about what we can do to renew democracy in a way that allows us to address this existential crisis about climate change. But there was a very specific question as well, which is that just now there's a controversy on Facebook about climate change misinformation being not fact-checked because it's considered just an opinion. And there's a big back and forth. I'm not sure if we know all the underlying facts yet. But it points to this challenge of trying to discuss such an important issue when it's been so politicized. And I wonder if you can all touch on that if you can, or if you can't, don't worry about it, but just give us your closing thoughts. And I just want to say, I think this has been a fascinating conversation. It shouldn't be our last conversation. You've put out so many ideas and they're each worth pursuing in much greater depth. And I hope that we can all join with you in figuring out how to turn them into reality. So why don't we start with Molly?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think Nathan's point about the debate about abortion in Ireland is a really great example of what deliberation can do for really contested and controversial concepts like climate change. And I think getting more citizens to for a while, people used to think that democracy was uniquely sort of ill-suited for facing the challenges of climate change. And I think that if we take a more deliberative approach, that we would see have more reason to hope that democracy can face this existential threat. And I'll just conclude with saying I develop a lot of these ideas about the importance of listening, the challenge of listening, in my book that's coming out in September with Oxford University Press called Beyond Empathy and Inclusion: The Challenge of Listening and Democratic Deliberation. So for those people who are interested in more on sort of the limits of putting ourselves in other people's shoes and sort of the need to listen even in the absence of empathy to those we really deeply disagree with, that would be somewhere.
Great. And Nathan, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the climate change issue raises again this point of how can democracies face systemic transformation, which is what is needed these days, as Helle pointed out. Systemic transformation, whether it has to do with climate or whether it has to do with racial justice or inequality, systemic change cannot take place unless there is a governing consensus. The governing consensus means a silo of this group or this partisan or that partisan is incapable of making systemic change. It only paralyzes the society. Unless you have this type of deliberative process that can reach a governing consensus, systemic change will be impossible, whether it's climate or other things. The French example is the perfect one. There was an uprising against Macron's policies on fuel taxes, which hurt working class people in the name of green elites, was the narrative. Now you have the possibility of making actual change because you included everyone whose daily life is affected into the process. So the lesson of deliberative democracy, if democracies are able to face systemic challenges, they need a deliberative process of participation without populism of the kind that we've been speaking about.
And Helle.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Molly and Nathan has said. I think we have a triple challenge here, which we have to deal with. We have a completely new world where we have a digital way of working with each other, with communicating, with anything, and we have a completely new system that we have to understand. Then we have these enormous systemic changes that Nathan is talking about, and then we have this new way of being as people, where we don't have any patience for anything that is slow, something tradition doesn't count. There's so many things that makes us challenge democracy. And this is a triple slam to democracy. So I feel we are in a similar time now as we as Europeans were in 1919 after the First World War, where we had to reinvent democracy. There's so many things challenging our democracy. So everyone who actually believes in democracy, we need to ask ourselves the question, what are the new forms of democracy that we can create in the coming years? We will have to experiment. We will not get it right. We will debate about, for example, how do you regulate social media? But all of us who believe in democracy, we have to have this real debates and try to come up with tangible solutions in the coming years. We are in a similar impasse that citizens were 100 years ago, and this is a small way of trying to enhance that conversation. And to come up with new results and new ways of doing things. So thank you, Karen, Dawn, everyone who has put this together. Really appreciate to be part of it.
Thank you so much. You know, there's this phrase that President Teddy Roosevelt talked about, being in the arena. And, you know, if you're in the arena offering up ideas, there's going to be controversy, there's going to be debate. But I think what this report and what each of you has done is really, you know, gotten into the arena with some serious proposals that are worth serious debate, and we have to thank you very much for that.
And you can get the report on the Berggruen website.
Well done, Nathan.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you all.
Thanks.